Welcome to the deep dive. Imagine a civilization, just think about it, so vast, so ancient. It's been evolving continuously for thousands of years. It's shaped its own people, obviously, but also influenced cultures and ideas right across the globe. We're talking about India, of course. And today, well, we're embarking on a deep dive. It's designed to give you a real shortcut, a way to truly understand this incredible journey. Our mission, basically, is to pull out the most important bits of knowledge from our source material. It's a pretty comprehensive look at the what, how, and the why of human social behavior in India. We'll trace the key factors, the conditions, the forces that have impacted everything from, say, daily routines to really deeply held beliefs, right from ancient times up to now. So our source lays this all out across three main periods: ancient and medieval India, then the colonial period, and finally post-independent India. And as we go, we'll be looking at these crucial threads like religious beliefs, the status of women, education, social life, urbanization, all that stuff. So yeah, buckle up.
We're about to unpack how India's past really continues to powerfully shape its present and, well, what that all means for you. Okay, let's cast our minds back then, way back. When we say ancient, we really are talking millennia, thousands of years. And here's the thing, sociology, as a formal academic discipline, it didn't really emerge until much, much later in Europe. So how do we even begin to get a handle on what social life was actually like in ancient India?
That's a really fundamental question, isn't it? Our understanding, it doesn't come from neat sociological studies. Not at all. It comes more from like a mosaic of different sources. We have to piece it together. We use archaeological artifacts, tools, jewelry, paintings, things dug up from excavations, bones, even geographical clues. And then alongside that, we have these invaluable historical records, travelogues, memoirs, detailed court chronicles, that sort of thing. I mean, it's an immense span of time. Impossible to cover every single detail, obviously, but certain powerful themes, they definitely emerge.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then. Religious beliefs and practices. Going back to the Harappan civilization, 2600 BCE to 1500 BCE. What does our source tell us about their spiritual world? What do they believe?
Well, what's really striking about the Harappan period is the evidence we actually have. We find these male and mother goddess figurines, and animal deities too. It seems natural elements like the sun, rain, water, thunder, they were clearly venerated, held in high regard. But here's the really unexpected part. There's absolutely no evidence of grand temples or, idol worship from this specific era.
Yeah.
And that absence, it's quite telling, actually, especially when you compare it to the religious expressions that came later.
No temples. That's fascinating. So moving forward then to Vedic India, say 1500 BCE to 500 BCE, and that splits into early and later Vedic periods, right? How did that spiritual landscape start to shift? How did it evolve?
Yeah, we definitely see a transition from sort of simple hymns towards venerating specific personified deities like Indra, the god of thunder, and Agni, the god of fire. This era is really foundational for what becomes the Hindu way of life. It's rooted in literary sources like the Vedas, the Upanishads, the great epics. And a core belief, one that just permeates this whole worldview, is the law of karma. The idea that as you sow, so shall you reap. It's a cyclical view of life. Your deeds in one life, they determine your next one. And it's all leading towards this ultimate goal of moksha.
Moksha, right, salvation.
Exactly, salvation from this whole cycle of birth and rebirth.
And central to that Hindu way of life are those famous four aims, the Purusharthas. What's really profound about these aims, I think, is how they provided this holistic framework, not just for, spiritual liberation, but for living a balanced, ethical life within society. Can you unpack those Purusharthas for us?
Absolutely. So the Purusharthas are, first, dharma. That's about doing your duties righteously, correctly, without expecting an immediate reward. Then there's kama. That covers sensuous pleasure, even sexual union, but always, always pursued through righteousness, ethically. Then artha. That's acquiring wealth, but again, righteously, through hard work and honest means. And finally, moksha, the ultimate goal we mentioned, salvation from the cycle. Now, what's really key here is that in the early Vedic society, things were relatively flexible regarding occupation. But in the later Vedic period, we see this crucial shift. The Varnas, these sort of broader theoretical social classes, they began to rigidify. They hardened into jati, what we commonly call caste. And this became a really fixed system based on concepts of purity and pollution. And this led to strict endogamy, marrying only within your own caste, and really elaborate ritualism.
Wow, that increasing rigidity, that sounds like it would inevitably cause some significant tension, right?
Yeah.
Did it spark any kind of counter movements or philosophical challenges during this period?
Oh, it absolutely did. Yes, this rigidity, and particularly the the Brahminical supremacy and all the ritualism, it led to the emergence of what our source calls protest religions, namely Jainism and Buddhism.
Okay, tell us about Jainism first.
Jainism has incredibly ancient roots. Its teachings were revealed by 24 Tirthankaras, with Ardama and Mahavir being the last one. Now, it shares the Hindu concept of karma, but it places this immense emphasis on ahimsa, non-harming, non-violence, and tapas, which is intense penance or austerity. Mahavir didn't really focus on the concept of God per se, but more on achieving nirvana, liberation. And what's really key here is that his teachings were in Ardangagari. That was a language of the common people, not the elite Sanskrit. So it made them widely accessible.
Accessible, right.
Yeah, and here's a fascinating little detail. 5 of the Solasati, these are 16 revered, virtuous women from ancient texts recognized in Jainism. They're also shared with Hinduism. It shows that underlying cultural continuity, you see.
That's a great example, yeah. Those shared cultural threads running through different spiritual paths, even diverging ones. And what about Buddhism? How did that emerge?
Well, Gautama Buddha, he also advocated a path away from the extremes. He called it the middle path, based on his 4 noble truths and the Eightfold Path. And like Jainism, there's no concept of a personal god in early Buddhism. There's sacred literature that Tripitakas was written in Pali, again, another common language.
Deliberately moving away from Sanskrit.
Exactly, a deliberate move to reach more people. And monasticism became central. Communities for monks, called bhikkhus, and later for nuns, bhikkhunis. This was key for both personal and societal development. And crucially, both Jainism and Buddhism were non-theistic schools, and they welcomed everyone, all sections of society, which really broadened the path to salvation beyond those strict caste barriers.
So they offered a more inclusive path.
Very much so. And Buddhism, perhaps because its rules were a bit less rigid than Jainism's, it spread incredibly widely, even beyond India. A lot of that was thanks to the patronage of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka. It reached places like Tibet, China, Japan.
Wow.
Yeah. And the Jataka tales, these stories from around 300 BCE to 400 CE, they illustrate Buddha's past lives. They're just a brilliant example of how morals and virtues were taught through really engaging stories.
Stories people could relate to.
Precisely. Now, over time, as often happens, both religions evolved and split into different sects. They developed slightly different interpretations. So you get, for instance, the Digambaras and Shvetambaras in Jainism and Hinayana and Mahayana in Buddhism, each offering, distinct approaches to spiritual practice.
It's really remarkable how these philosophies first challenged the established order and then managed to spread their influence so incredibly broadly. Okay, now let's shift gears quite dramatically. We arrive at the medieval period, roughly 650 CE to 1500 CE. This is when we start seeing new religions arriving from outside India. How did these external faiths begin to integrate or maybe clash with this already rich tapestry?
Yes, this era introduces some truly diverse threads into the mix. Judaism, for example, is believed to be one of the very earliest foreign religions to arrive, possibly as early as the 1st century CE. The tradition says it was brought by King Solomon's merchants who came for trade. And the Kochi Jews, their synagogue in Fort Kochi, they stand as this living testament to that ancient presence.
Still there today.
Still there. It's a monotheistic faith, of course, following the Torah and believing the Messiah is yet to come. And this community, despite facing persecution elsewhere in the world, managed to maintain its identity in India, even though their numbers dwindled over time.
And Christianity also arrived quite early, didn't it? Around the same time.
Yes. Tradition credits St. Thomas, one of the apostles of Jesus Christ, with bringing Christianity to South India, also in the 1st century CE. It's also monotheistic, has a linear view of life, birth, life, death, afterlife, and it's centered on love and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Then, of course, there's Islam, which had such a profound and lasting impact.
Islam arrived initially in the 8th century CE, but its major political and cultural influence really began from the 12th century onwards. It's a monotheistic faith, guided by the Holy Quran and the 5 pillars of faith. And the Delhi Sultanate, which lasted from 1206 to 1526 CE, was this powerful Islamic empire ruling a huge part of India for centuries. Now, this period, it fostered a really remarkable Indo-Islamic cultural synthesis. You see it clearly in architecture, in language like the emergence of Hindi Urdu.
A blending.
A real blending. However, it's also important, as our source notes, that this era saw widespread destruction of existing temples. That was a significant disruption, obviously, to existing religious structures and practices.
It's fascinating, though, how some rulers, amidst all this, actually attempted to bridge these diverse religious perspectives. Emperor Akbar, for instance.
Indeed. Emperor Akbar is famous for creating Din-i-Ilahi. It was this unique, syncretic religion based on ethical rationalism. His aim was really to synthesize all faiths, emphasizing universal toleration. And interestingly, without the need for priesthood, complex rituals, or even specific sacred texts.
A bold experiment.
A very bold experiment, yes. Though ultimately it remained quite localized and didn't outlast him significantly.
And then Sikhism emerged, another major indigenous faith born in this period.
That's right. Sikhism, founded by Guru Nanak in the late 15th century CE, really flourished in the Punjab region. Now, like Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, it teaches the karma theory. Actions have consequences. However, it fundamentally rejected the existing caste hierarchy. It championed equality for absolutely everyone in worship and in daily life. The Guru Granth Sahib is their sacred text.
And the Langar.
Oh, yes, the Langar. What's truly a unique and powerful symbol of charity and equality in Sikhism is the Langar. It's a community kitchen, institutionalized by Guru Nanak himself. It offers free vegetarian meals to absolutely everyone, regardless of their caste, creed, age, gender, or social status. It's quite remarkable.
It really is. We also have Zoroastrianism, which is a much older faith but found a new home in India during this time.
Yes, Zoroastrianism is one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions. It's centered on this dualistic cosmology, the constant struggle between good and evil. Persecution back in their homeland, Persia, brought them from the Middle East to Gujarat, likely around the 9th century CE. Now, they're quite unique among these religions that came from outside because they still, to this day, strictly practice endogamy marrying within the community. And they restrict entry to their fire temples to community members only. Very. And despite their relatively small numbers, the Parsi community, as they're known in India, has made truly significant contributions across all walks of life, including huge industrial giants like Tata and Godrej, and brilliant legal minds like Nani Pokiwala. Really punched above their weight, you could say.
Absolutely. Now, amidst all these new faiths arriving and the shifts happening within established traditions like Hinduism, were there also internal Hindu reform movements happening during the medieval period, trying to address some of the issues?
Oh, absolutely. The Bhakti movement is a prime example. It emerged as a powerful force for reform within Hinduism. It strongly rejected the rigidities of the caste system, criticized what it saw as excessive ritualism, and really advocated for simplicity and equality before God. This was often expressed through passionate devotional singing and poetry. Bhakti. Exactly. And similarly, Sufism, which is the mystical branch of Islam, also preached unity and equality, often finding common ground with Bhakti ideals. Exponents like Kabir or even Guru Nanak, who kind of transcended traditional religious boundaries, they denounced purely external observances and idol worship. They emphasized a direct personal connection with the divine.
That's a really profound spiritual evolution happening there. Okay, let's pivot now to something equally fundamental. The status of women in society during these long periods. Our source suggests, maybe surprisingly to some, a comparatively high status in the early Vedic period. What did that actually look like in practice?
Well, in the early Vedic period, women certainly seem to have enjoyed a, comparatively elevated status, although we should remember patriarchal systems were still definitely present. But crucially, they had access to Vedic education, and they could undergo the Upanayana, or sacred thread ceremony. That was the key, really, that enabled entry into Gurukul education, the formal learning system.
So they could study the Vedas.
They could. The Rig Veda itself actually grants high status to qualified, learned women. And we see two main categories mentioned: Sadhivadu, who were women educated up until their marriage, and Brahmavadinis, who were essentially lifelong scholars, dedicated to learning. They also had a voice in social assemblies, these gatherings called Vidath. And sources suggest they even had some freedom in choosing their partners. Marriage itself was seen as a sacrament, a sacred bond.
Okay, so given that relatively progressive picture, at least compared to what came later, what happened, what caused such a significant decline in the later Vedic period and then into medieval India? It seems like a really stark contrast.
It truly is a stark contrast. The main drivers seem to be the deepening entrenchment of the caste system, as we discussed, and the solidification of Brahminical supremacy. These factors led to women becoming, doubly oppressed, both by caste and by gender norms. The Upanayana ceremony, the key to formal learning, was denied to them. Instead, child marriage often became their primary sacrament, their main rite of passage.
So education was basically cut off.
Largely, yes. Formal Vedic education. Women were increasingly confined to household duties, barred from participating in those social assemblies, and became deeply subordinate within the family structure. Often subjected to what are called the three obediences, first to her father, then to her husband, and finally, if widowed, to her son.
That's quite restrictive.
Extremely. Dowry practices also began to emerge during this time, and widow remarriage, which seems to have been permitted earlier, became increasingly taboo. And then you have the rise of practices like sati, widow immolation, on her husband's pyre, the veiling and seclusion of women, and the Devadasi system.
Which involved dedicating girls to temples.
Yes, dedicating girls to temples, which unfortunately often led to their exploitation. All these practices sadly made women objects of systematic exploitation in many cases. Overall, female education during this long period became really bleak, generally limited to private tutoring within wealthy upper caste or aristocratic families.
That is a truly stark picture. But you mentioned the protest religions earlier, Jainism and Buddhism. Did they offer any different path or perhaps some hope for women during these obviously challenging times?
Yes, thankfully, both religions did offer something of a beacon of hope. Jainism, for instance, explicitly recognized women's potential and role on the path to liberation. The Shvetambara sect, one of the major branches, specifically highlights distinguished and learned women in its history. And quite notably, Jain nuns were known to actively campaign against social evils like sati and the dasi, or servant-slave system.
They were activists in a way.
In a way, yes. Social reformers. And Gautama Buddha also permitted women, the bhikkhunis, to join his monastic community, the Sangha, and participate fully in spiritual life. Now, while some early texts suggested women could gain enlightenment but perhaps couldn't become a fully enlightened Buddha themselves, Buddha consistently emphasized the valuable and fruitful role women could play in society. He even mentioned the managing family affairs effectively in a husband's absence. So, yes, they offered alternative spaces and perspectives.
Okay, let's turn now to the nature of education itself throughout these long historical periods. What can we actually discern about the Harappan civilization's approach to learning, given the lack of texts?
Well, it's intriguing. We don't have books, obviously, but we do have inscriptions found on numerous seals, on pottery, various household objects. And these inscriptions strongly suggest that the Harappan civilization was, in fact, a literate populace, at least to some degree. This implies some kind of foundational education system must have existed, even if we don't know the precise details of how it worked.
Right, they could read and write something. And then moving into the early Vedic period, what was that educational system like? We know women had access initially.
Yes. Education then was primarily based on the sacred Sanskrit literature, the Vedas. The Yajur Veda and Atharva Veda specifically indicate that education was intended for all classes and, as you said, initially included women. Entry into these Vedic schools, the Gurukuls, required that Upanayana ceremony we talked about, at least for the first three, Varnas Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas. This was followed by a period of brahmacharya, basically celibate studenthood.
And how was knowledge transmitted?
Primarily orally, through rote learning. There was a huge emphasis on precise enunciation and pronunciation of the sacred texts. The core aim wasn't just, memorizing facts. It was about character formation, discipline, sharpening the intellect. In fact, it's believed that writing itself was largely unknown or not widely used for transmitting the sacred knowledge at that very early stage.
Really? Oral tradition was that strong?
Immensely strong. Values like truthfulness, performing one's duty, dharma, and deep devotion to one's gurus or teachers were profoundly stressed. Different Varnas would also learn specialized skills relevant to their societal roles. And this knowledge was transmitted by rishis, sages, and seers who were often, though not exclusively, from the Brahmana class.
But as we've already discussed regarding the status of women, things took a negative turn in the later Vedic period for female education, didn't they?
They certainly did. Women were unfortunately denied the Upanayana ceremony and, as a direct consequence, lost access to formal Vedic learning in the Gurukuls. Alongside this restriction, asceticism renouncing worldly life emerged as a significant alternative means of seeking salvation. New philosophical teachings were often disseminated through intense public debates and discussions. This period also saw the rise of these wandering teachers, known as Shamanas or Parivrajakas. This group included influential figures like Mahavir, the founder of Jainism, and Gautama Buddha.
And they challenged the establishment.
They did. They often rejected the authority of the Vedas and the practice of animal sacrifices, emphasizing instead the principle of ahimsa, non-harming, in their teachings.
So Buddhist education, which you mentioned was centered in monasteries, must have been quite different from the Gurukul system.
Fundamentally different, yes. Buddhist education took place in monasteries, known as Viharas. These became the spiritual and intellectual core of the Buddhist order, the Sangha, for both monks and nuns. And a truly transformative aspect was this. Admission into the Sangha generally meant shedding one's previous caste identity, your old life. It fostered this powerful sense of equality and fraternity.
A fresh start, regardless of background.
Exactly. The bond between the learner and the teacher was absolutely paramount. And importantly, we see the emergence of eminent female teachers, known as theras, among the nuns. This created crucial new avenues for female education and also for social service undertaken by women. And of course, great institutions like Nalanda and Takshashila rose to become world-renowned Buddhist universities, centers of learning attracting scholars from afar, although sadly they no longer exist today.
Incredible centers of learning. And then shifting again to the medieval period, the arrival of Islam brought yet another distinct educational system into the mix.
Yes, Islamic education during this period primarily centered on the Quran. And since reading the Quran is fundamental, it inherently required and promoted literacy among Muslims. It was also remarkably open in principle to all followers, regardless of their social status. It didn't generally have the same kind of rigid entry requirements based on birth as the earlier Vedic schools.
How was it structured?
Education was typically structured across different levels. You had maktabs, which provided elementary learning. Children often started around age 4, focusing on reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and then starting Quranic studies around age 7. For higher learning, there were madrasas. These were often attached to mosques and offered comprehensive study of the Quran, the Hadith, sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, but also practical subjects, things like agriculture, history, mathematics, Islamic law, and languages like Arabic and Persian were taught.
Practical skills, too.
Yes, and what's truly noteworthy here, something our source highlights, is Emperor Akbar's rather forward-thinking approach. He actually allowed Hindu students in the madrasas to study Sanskrit and even the Upanishads.
That's quite inclusive for the time.
It really was. There were also khanqahs. These were centers, often associated with Sufi orders, providing theological training, somewhat akin to European monasteries in function. Arts and crafts also flourished during this period, often heavily influenced by the tastes and patronage of the Muslim rulers. However, it's important to reiterate that education for women, generally speaking, suffered during much of this medieval period. It was mainly limited to private instruction within upper-class or aristocratic households.
Okay. Turning our focus now to social life. More broadly, let's go back to the Harappan civilization. What does it reveal about how people actually lived together, organized themselves?
Well, the Harappan civilization is justly renowned for its incredibly well-planned towns. Features like covered drainage systems, large communal granaries, and that impressive Great Bath structure in Mohenjo-Daro. All of these point towards a highly organized collective way of life. Society seems to have been structured more horizontally, perhaps based on skills and occupation, distinct groups of peasants, artisans, traders, rather than a rigid vertical hierarchy like the later caste system.
So, less rigidly stratified.
It appears so, yes. It really suggests a remarkably advanced urban civilization for its time. We even have, as mentioned in our source, recorded trade references from Sumerian documents in Mesopotamia, indicating extensive external contacts.
And the Vedic period introduced a Varna system, which obviously had a profound and lasting impact on social structure.
Yes, the Varna system, which, as we noted, seems to have been initially quite flexible, perhaps based more on one's aptitude or occupation, guna and karma, gradually transformed. It became that rigid jati or caste hierarchy. This system was based on complex, often hereditary notions of purity and pollution, and it deeply impacted almost every aspect of daily life. Rules about food preparation and sharing, appropriate dress, who you could interact with socially, marriage partners, everything.
And the four main Varnas
were the Brahmins, priests, scholars, Kshatriyas, warriors, rulers, Vaishyas, merchants, farmers, traders, and Shudras, laborers, service providers. The first three of these were considered twice born, or Dvija, meaning they were entitled to undergo the Upanayana ceremony and study the Vedas. And alongside this Varna system, there was the Ashrambi of Vasta. This outlined 4 distinct stages of life, particularly for the Dvija castes.
The stages of life.
Exactly. Guiding individuals ideally from brahmacharya, studenthood, through grihastha, householder stage, vanaprastha, retirement withdrawal stage, to sannyasa, renunciation in old age, a kind of ideal life map.
Right. And then the classical period, particularly under the Gupta dynasty, is often celebrated as a golden age.
Yeah.
What made it so special in terms of social and cultural life?
Yes, that era, roughly 4th to 6th century CE, was indeed a time of tremendous growth and flourishing. It really laid fundamental foundations in Indian arts, sciences, politics, and philosophy that resonate even today. India became a bustling global trade center during this time, and it was a true epicenter of intellectual achievement. You had brilliant minds like the mathematician and astronomer Aryabhata, who calculated the length of the solar year with astounding accuracy and even proposed that the Earth was a sphere rotating on its axis.
Incredible advancement.
Truly, education was clearly a priority, and sources suggest there was an emphasis on providing relatively equal opportunities for learning, at least compared to later periods. It was a time of great cultural confidence and creativity.
Following that golden age, India experienced what historians term the second urbanization. What characterized that period?
This happened roughly around 500 BCE to 200 BCE, maybe a bit earlier in some places. After a period of significant deforestation and expansion of agriculture, large-scale town and city life reemerged, especially in the fertile Gangetic Basin. This period saw the rise of codified socio-political laws written down in texts like the Dharma Sutras and Shastras. But there's a disheartening caveat here.
Which is?
Punishments for the same crime often varied significantly depending on one's jati, or caste. This unfortunately served to further entrench and deepen the existing caste hierarchy. This was also the time when coinage first appeared and became widespread, making trade easier. Cities solidified as vital centers of administration and commerce, and we see the formation of professional guilds for artisans and merchants shrenis, which played a major economic and sometimes social role.
Right. Moving into the medieval period now, how did the Delhi Sultanate influence social structures, and what does our source highlight about the cultural interactions during that time?
The Delhi Sultanate, being an Islamic empire ruling over a largely non-Muslim population, introduced a new political and, to some extent, social hierarchy, often described as feudal. But what's particularly insightful, and something our source emphasizes, is the remarkable synthesis that occurred between Indian and Islamic cultures. This is most visible in things like architecture, where new Indo-Islamic styles emerged, blending arches and domes with traditional Indian motifs. And in language, as we mentioned, with the development of Hindustani, which later branched into Hindi and Urdu.
So interaction and blending.
Yes, significant interaction and blending. However, as we also noted earlier, this period is regrettably marked by incidents of widespread temple destruction, representing a major point of conflict and social disruption. Sociologists really recognize this entire medieval era as one of profound, complex transformation for Indian society. Our source also introduces a really valuable concept here, borrowed from anthropologists Milton Singer and Robert Redfield, the idea of great and little traditions.
Great and little traditions. Okay, how does that help us understand India's incredibly multi-layered culture?
It's a really useful lens, actually. Great traditions refer to the more standardized, often text-based, elite, or pan-Indian cultural forms and ideologies. Think of things like classical Sanskrit literature, complex philosophical systems, or the highly structured systems of Hindustani or Carnatic classical music. These transcend local boundaries.
Okay, the big overarching tradition.
Exactly. Little traditions, in contrast, encompass the more localized, diverse, often orally transmitted, folk-based practices and beliefs. This could be regional folk art styles, specific village deity worship, local festivals, or a vibrant folk dance form like the Lavani of Maharashtra, for example.
So local flavors.
Precisely. This framework helps us appreciate the incredible diversity and the multiple layers coexisting within Indian culture, from the grand, established narratives right down to the vibrant, everyday local expressions. They constantly interact, too.
That's a helpful distinction. And finally, on this section, urbanization. We began by noting the Harappan civilization was the first urbanization. What was distinctive about that second urbanization we just discussed?
Right. The Harappan civilization clearly demonstrates that first urbanization. It showcased incredibly sophisticated, well-planned city life with advanced urban amenities, individual wells, private bathrooms, covered drainage systems. Quite astonishing for the time. We even have those ancient Sumerian documents from Mesopotamia referencing trade with Moluha, which most scholars identify as the Indus region.
And the second?
The second urbanization, emerging from around 500 or 600 BCE onwards, really blossomed following significant deforestation and a major expansion of settled agriculture, especially in the Gangetic Plain. This period saw large-scale town and city life become much more widespread. These cities became crucial hubs for political administration and burgeoning trade networks. Crucially, this is when coinage became widespread, facilitating commerce. And those specialized artisan and merchant guilds, the shrenis, began to organize and formalize, playing a key role in the urban economy.
Okay, shifting gears quite dramatically now, we arrive at the colonial period. This spans roughly from the 16th up to the mid-20th century CE. This was obviously a truly transformative era, one that laid many of the foundations for modern India, but often with really profound and sometimes quite contradictory consequences.
That's absolutely right. It's hard to overstate the impact. And what's striking here is the sheer scale and depth of the British influence. Although we should remember other European powers, the Portuguese, Dutch, French, were also present, initially for trade. But the British East India Company and later the British Crown had the most pervasive effect. And while the British legacy certainly includes some positive social reforms, often enabled or pushed through by their policies, there were also significant, often detrimental, long-term consequences that completely reshaped Indian society.
Let's start with education, because that seems like a fundamental area of change. How did the British fundamentally reshape the educational landscape in India?
Well, they established an entirely new system, largely displacing or marginalizing traditional forms of learning. English became the primary medium of instruction, especially in high schools and higher education. This quickly turned English into a common language, a lingua franca, among the educated elite across different regions of India.
Which had its own consequences.
Huge consequences, and crucially, at least in principle, the new schools and colleges established by the British, or missionaries under their rule, were open to all individuals, irrespective of caste, creed, or gender. This was a major departure from many of the restrictions in previous systems. Landmark universities were established, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, all in 1857. And the content of this new education was largely secular. It included subjects like mathematics, science, Western philosophy, and significantly introduced disciplines like sociology itself.
So it fostered a new way of thinking.
It absolutely fostered a new Indian intelligentsia, people educated in this system, steeped in what were then seen as Western values, rationality, equality, social justice. And ironically, it was this very group that then went on to spearhead many of the social reform movements and eventually the independence movement.
And culturally, this exposure led to what the sociologist M.N. Srinivasan famously termed Westernization.
Yeah.
What did that actually look like in practice?
Precisely. It meant that many among the educated Indian elite began adopting British lifestyles, mannerisms, dress, tastes, and ways of thinking. It was partly aspirational, partly practical. Another sociologist, Syed Hussain Alatas, offered a useful framework for thinking about this cultural impact. He talked about different types. There was an eliminative impact, where old cultural elements started to fade out. There was an additive impact, where new cultural things were added, like English education itself, or cricket. A supportive impact, where British policies might actually strengthen some existing Indian traits, perhaps unintentionally. And a synthetic impact, where old and new blended together to create something new. Think of certain styles of colonial architecture or Anglo-Indian cuisine. It was a really complex interplay.
Right, not just a simple replacement. The administrative structure also saw massive changes under British rule, didn't it? A whole new bureaucracy.
Oh, completely. The British introduced entirely new centralized administrative services covering economics, education, revenue collection, general administration. They built the steel frame of the Indian civil service. They also established a new unified judiciary system based on British legal principles, which gradually replaced or overlaid diverse traditional systems. Now, this new system was implemented, at least officially, on a secular basis. It aimed to judge individuals equally before the law, regardless of their caste or creed.
It was a big change.
A huge change, in theory. And this principle, over time, did help to gradually permeate democratic values and challenge the absolute power of traditional feudal lords or local rulers. Key pieces of legislation like the Indian Councils Act, the High Court Act, and the Civil Service Act, all passed around 1861, brought about major, lasting shifts in how India was governed. It created a modern bureaucratic state, albeit one serving colonial interests.
And the economy, it was completely transformed as well, wasn't it? Often not for the better for many Indians.
Profoundly transformed, yes, and often with devastating consequences for traditional industries and agriculture. You saw some industrial growth, particularly in sectors that served British needs, like textiles initially, then railways, jute, coal, and urbanization accelerated. This did gradually begin to change the old patterns of caste-based occupations as new jobs emerged in factories, railways, ports. However, and this is a big however, the new land revenue systems imposed by the British often had disastrous effects on peasants, leading to indebtedness and loss of land. And the forced commercialization of agriculture, shifting from growing food for local consumption to growing cash crops like cotton or indigo for British industry, replaced subsistence farming.
Leading to shortages.
Exactly. It made the agricultural economy much more vulnerable to market fluctuations and climate shocks, leading to widespread profiteering by middlemen and, tragically, recurrent devastating famines. The ones in Bengal and Odisha in 1856, mentioned in our source, are grim examples. Millions died.
But on the infrastructure side, they did bring significant improvements, particularly in transport and communication, which had long-term effects.
That's undeniable. They built an extensive network of railways across the country, primarily for strategic military control and efficient extraction of resources, but it also, unintendedly, connected people and regions as never before. Roadways were improved, and a modern postal and telegraph system was set up, spanning the entire country. This fundamentally improved communication and access to people and resources. And the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 was a massive game changer for trade.
Oh, so.
It drastically shortened the sea route between India and Britain. This significantly boosted trade by making it much quicker and cheaper to transport raw materials from India to factories in England, and also increased market outlets for British manufactured goods back into India. It integrated India much more tightly, though unevenly, into the global capitalist economy dominated by Britain.
And you mentioned earlier that all these changes in education, administration, communication, ironically contributed to the rise of the Indian nationalist movement.
They absolutely did. English, ironically, having become a common language among the educated elite across different linguistic regions, played a crucial role. It enabled communication, networking, and the sharing of ideas among nationalists who might otherwise have been divided by language barriers. It provided a vital platform for promoting nationalist ideals.
So the tools of the colonizer were turned against them.
In many ways, yes. It gave momentum to the movement for self-rule and eventually independence. The late 19th century witnessed the formation of key organizations like the Indian National Congress in 1885, and later, in the 20th century, figures like Mahatma Gandhi emerged, who brilliantly used both modern communication methods and traditional symbols to mobilize the masses against British rule.
The 19th century was also a hotbed for social reform movements, often led by these same newly educated Western-influenced Indians, wasn't it?
Yes, very much so. It was a period of intense intellectual ferment and social questioning within Indian society itself. Groups like the Brahmo Samaj, founded by Raja Rammohun Roy in Bengal, and the Arya Samaj, founded by Swami Dayanand Saraswati in Western India, were hugely influential. They actively worked to reform what they saw as obsolete or harmful social and religious practices, things like sati, idol worship in some cases, the rigidities of caste. They strongly promoted education, particularly for women and for those traditionally considered lower castes. Their aim was often framed as restoring a purer, more rational form of Vedic tradition, while also integrating beneficial aspects of modern Western thought and curriculum. They were crucial in raising social consciousness and pushing for change from within.
And this internal pressure from Indian reformers, combined perhaps with some changing attitudes in Britain itself, eventually led the British government to pass significant pieces of social legislation.
That's right. Increased awareness and pressure from these reform groups definitely played a role in nudging the colonial government to act against certain widely condemned social evils. Now, as our source rightly points out, laws alone don't instantly transform deep-seated societal norms and attitudes. Change is always slower and more complex than that.
Of course.
But these laws did provide a crucial legal framework. They offered hope and a measure of protection to victims of injustice, and they signaled a formal condemnation of these practices by the state. Some of the landmark legislations from this period include the Prevention of Sati Act way back in 1829, the Indian Slavery Act of 1843, the Caste Disabilities Removal Act of 1850, which aimed to protect the rights of converts, the Hindu Widow Remarriage Act of 1856, the Female Infanticide Prevention Act of 1870, and much later the Child Marriage Restraint Act, or SARTA Act, of 1929.
That's quite a list.
It is. And taken together, these acts marked a major, if incomplete, effort by the colonial state, often prompted by Indian reformers, to begin dismantling some deeply entrenched social hierarchies and practices, reflecting that ongoing, evolving struggle to align the country's legal framework with emerging modern ideals of equality and basic human rights.
Okay, so after this incredible, complex journey through ancient, medieval, and then the tumultuous colonial period in India, let's bring it up to the present. Post-independent India, after 1947. What does all this history mean for India today? Obviously, the country charted its own course after independence, but those millennia of history and the deep impact of the colonial period must have left a really complex, layered legacy, right? Creating both new challenges and new opportunities.
Absolutely. That's the perfect way to put it, a complex and layered legacy. If we connect this to the bigger picture, modern India is fundamentally guided by two main things: the principles and values enshrined in its own constitution, and the strategic plans and policies set by its successive governments since 1947. It's this continuous process of negotiation, really, between inherited traditions, the colonial imprint, and the aspirations of a modern, independent nation-state.
And the Constitution of India, adopted in 1950 after being framed starting in 1946, is clearly that foundational document. It shapes pretty much everything that followed.
It absolutely is. It was framed by the Constituent Assembly, famously chaired by the brilliant Dr. B.R. Ambedkar himself, from a formerly untouchable community, which is hugely significant. And it's a remarkable document in its scope and ambition. It consciously drew inspiration and borrowed features from constitutions all around the world, including Australia, Canada, the US, the UK, Ireland, demonstrating a truly global comparative outlook from the very beginning.
What are its core principles?
Well, it cherishes fundamental rights like liberty, equality, and fraternity. It explicitly recognizes and seeks to accommodate India's immense linguistic, religious, and cultural diversity. And it firmly establishes India as a secular state, meaning the state maintains neutrality and respect towards all religions, protecting the rights of minorities. It's also designed as a living document. It has been amended numerous times over the decades to adapt to changing circumstances and societal needs. A recent, very significant example mentioned in our source is the abrogation of Article 370 in August 2019, which removed the special autonomous status previously granted to the state of Jammu and Kashmir.
Right. And building on those core constitutional principles, the Indian Parliament has continued to enact laws specifically aimed at addressing deep-seated social issues and inequalities. What are some of the landmark social laws passed since independence that have really tried to reshape social norms?
Yes, Parliament has been very active in this area, enacting a vast array of laws covering not just civil and criminal matters, but specifically targeting social reform. Some of the really crucial social legislations highlighted in our source include the Special Marriage Act of 1954, which provided a legal framework for interreligious and intercaste marriages outside of personal religious laws. The Hindu Code Bill, passed in parts around 1955-56, which brought significant reforms to Hindu personal law regarding marriage, divorce, inheritance, and adoption, aiming to grant more rights to women.
A big step for Hindu women's rights.
A massive step. Then there was the Untouchability Offenses Act of 1955, which legally abolished the practice of untouchability and made its enforcement a punishable offense. This was later renamed and strengthened as the Protection of Civil Rights Act in 1976. You also have the Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961, trying to tackle the pervasive issue of dowry demands. The Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act of 1971, liberalizing abortion laws. More recently, the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act of 2005, the Protection of Children from Sexual Offenses, or POCSO Act of 2012, which was significantly amended in 2019 to increase penalties, and the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act of 2019.
That's a continuous effort over decades.
It really is. This ongoing legislative activity highlights India's consistent effort, at least on paper, to use the power of law as a tool for progressive social reform and delivering social justice, even if implementation remains a challenge.
Economically, India took a particular path initially after independence, but then shifted quite significantly later on. Can you trace that?
Yes. For the first few decades after 1947, India's economic growth strategy was largely guided by planned development through a series of 5-year plans. This was driven by broadly socialist principles, influenced by the Soviet model to some extent, where the government, the public sector, took the primary responsibility for major industries, infrastructure, and also areas like education and healthcare. It was about building self-reliance.
The commanding heights of the economy.
Exactly. But then, facing an economic crisis in 1991, India made a decisive shift. It embraced economic liberalization, privatization, and globalization, often referred to as the LPG reforms. This fundamentally opened up the Indian economy to foreign investment and market forces. More recently, since 2014, the government has introduced further key economic initiatives. Our source mentions things like demonetization, the withdrawal of high-value currency notes in 2016, the implementation of a unified goods and services tax, GST, to create a single national market, numerous targeted welfare schemes, and a strong policy push to promote domestic manufacturing and entrepreneurship, Startup India.
Education also saw a massive expansion after independence, didn't it? Building on the colonial base, but expanding access.
Without a doubt, there has been a truly significant quantitative expansion of educational institutions at all levels. From grassroots Anganwadis focusing on early childhood care and nutrition, right up to establishing world-class institutions like the IITs, Indian Institutes of Technology, and IMs, Indian Institutes of Management, plus a vast network of universities and colleges across the country. And alongside this, there's been rapid growth in vocational training and, more recently, online learning opportunities.
So more people getting educated.
Yes, enrollment numbers have swelled dramatically across all levels compared to 1947. Quality and equity remain challenges, of course. The National Education Policy, NEP 2020, represents the latest major effort by the government, aiming to comprehensively reform and transform the education system at every stage, from primary school right through to higher education and research. It's a very ambitious plan.
And politically, post-independence India famously embraced democracy, becoming and remaining the world's most populous democracy. How does that system function?
Yes. India adopted a robust parliamentary democratic system based on the British Westminster model, but adapted to its own federal context. It operates with three distinct branches of government: the executive, headed by the Prime Minister and Council of Ministers, the legislature, parliament, consisting of the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and an independent judiciary, headed by the Supreme Court. Each acts as a check and balance on the others. It also practices democratic decentralization through the Panchayati Raj system, aiming to ensure that power and decision-making reach the grassroots village level, although the effectiveness varies.
And the principle of equality.
The Constitution guarantees that all citizens are equal before the law and prohibits discrimination on grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. Modern India holds regular free and fair elections at national and state levels, with universal adult suffrage voting rights granted to all citizens aged 18 and above. It's a vibrant and often noisy multi-party federal system. You have major national parties, powerful state-level parties, and numerous regional parties. And importantly, a robust opposition is constitutionally recognized and plays a crucial role in scrutinizing and holding the government in power accountable.
And lots of different viewpoints.
Absolutely. What's truly dynamic and sometimes bewildering to outsiders is the constant dialogue, debate, and sheer range of multiple political views, left, right, center, and everything in between that coexist and constantly interact within India's vast and complex political landscape.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given us, and hopefully you, a real bird's-eye view of India's incredibly vast culture and the immense complex forces that have shaped it over millennia. It seems undeniable that understanding this layered past, the ancient roots, the medieval transformations, the colonial impact, the post-independence path, is absolutely essential if we want to grasp the complexities of India in the present day.
It's more than just understanding the past as something separate, isn't it? I think what's truly fascinating here, as the source implies, is how this deep historical knowledge doesn't just inform our present. It actively bears on what we do, why we do it, and how we think and behave today, often in ways we don't even consciously realize. Applying that sociological imagination, as C. Wright Mills called it, allows us to connect our personal experiences to these larger historical forces, to comprehend the disruptions, the continuities, and the incredibly multi-layered realities that define contemporary India.
That's a great way to put it. So, as you, our listener, reflect on this incredible journey we've taken through Indian society, maybe consider this final thought. What specific belief, practice, or perhaps even a social custom that originated way back in ancient or medieval India do you still observe continuing, maybe in a modified or even surprising way, in the 21st century world around you, whether in India or in the diaspora? And what new questions did that observation raise for you about its enduring influence, its relevance, or perhaps the need for further change? Something to mull over.